the meanwhile, we have two phenomenal papers coming up for you now. The first one by our next keynote speaker. This is Dr. Christine Morris. She is the Andrew A. David Professor of Greek Archaeology and History at Trinity College, Dublin. Her interests include Bronze Age archaeology, with particular interest in Crete and Minoan religion, and ancient goddesses, including their historiography within archaeology and their modern reception. She's the co-editor with Lucy Goodison of the phenomenal book, Ancient Goddesses. And she is here to speak with us today on rejecting the embrace of the goddess, Minoan archaeology and the divine feminine.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Christine?
Thanks.
Yay!
Thanks so much. Yes, I'm here. Let me see. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, all right. It's always the worrying point. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much to both Stephanie and Caroline for putting together this really wonderful conference. I've already learnt tons in the past day, and for inviting me to speak. I really welcome the opportunity to share my work and to benefit from the very rich and varied knowledge and skills from the other speakers and participants here. I'd like to begin with a few words to situate briefly my case study, especially for those of you who may be less familiar with the Minoans and the Cretan Bronze Age. Our time and place is the island of Crete in the Mediterranean and in the 2nd millennium BC. During this time frame, and from around 1900 BC, the island developed a complex early state society, as evidenced by the building of palaces, the use of writing systems, and the evidence for trade and interaction across the Mediterranean, and the aesthetic and technological achievements of the arts. And you're seeing on the screen, of course, the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, and some views of the palace and some of the artwork. Equally important is the modern context, or the timing of discovery and excavation, with material culture of the Cretan Bronze Age. Oops, hang on a minute. Sorry, just bear with me. Okay. I pressed the wrong button. Being well known from the early 20th century, following on from earlier explorations in mainland Greece and the Mycenaeans. On the slide here, we see the excavator Arthur Evans, who began to dig at Knossos from March 23rd, 1900. And I'd just like for a moment to acknowledge that, of course, he was not the first to excavate the site. That honor belonged to Minos Kalokerinos, who was a Greek archaeologist, but it was Evans who was able to purchase and gain permission to dig the site, and of course it's him that's associated with it. It's widely accepted that the man, Evans, and the modern context, the turn of the century, strongly influenced the way in which the excavated remains were presented and interpreted. I sometimes ask my students to imagine how they might see or envisage the Minoans if they become known at a different point in history or archaeological practice, and indeed to imagine them minus Evans. It's an almost impossible task, of course, but it foregrounds how strongly Evans, in this particular time frame, influenced and shaped the field of Minoan studies. His excavations and his many publications, culminating in the multi-volume Palace of Minos at Knossos, which you see stacked there to the left of him, coincided with a period of intense scholarly interest in ancient religion and with ideas of identifying shared or universal trajectories in relation especially to origins of religion and also its development. Key figures in these intellectual explorations were Sir James Frazer and also the Cambridge ritualists, including Jane Harrison, who notably found much to support her emerging ideas in these Minoan finds. Thus, Evans's narratives and interpretation of the finds, as his biographer and half-sister Joan noted, he had to make intelligible to other men, have deeply influenced how archaeologists and the wider public perceive the Minoans. This has resulted in a lively and important body of scholarship, exploring and critiquing his work and ideas, and by extension, the modern historiography of the Minoans. Such critiques are wide-ranging. They engage, for example, with his problematic reconstructions of the physical palace of Knossos, which you see there, of course, upper right on the slide in its full glory of reconstruction. In the middle, the black and white picture with Evans in white at the center shows the process of excavation and reconstruction, and lower down an aerial view. Today, the visitor visiting Knossos walks through a structure which is both a Minoan building and Evans's steel and concrete palace. Other architect fact types too were subjected to heavy reconstruction, especially frescoes where whole scenes were often recreated from very modest fragments. This has led some scholars to write of Evans inventing or creating the Minoans, which sometimes does give the misleading impression that he paid no close attention to the material evidence. In the context of the present conference, there are divergent scholarly evaluations around the extent to which Evans's ideas were shaped by Fraser. In a 2012 paper, which has the most brilliant title, Two Knights and a Goddess, Cynthia Eller has argued that Fraser's ideas were, quote, by far the most significant factor, end quote, in Evans's conceptualization of the Minoan goddess. A few years earlier, in her monograph Knossos and the Prophets of Modernism, Kathy Geer identified the figure of a boy god in particular as a creation that owes much to Fraser. But to take a viewpoint from the other end of the spectrum, we might note Nano Marinatus's recent examination of Evans in her book, Sir Arthur Evans and Minoan Crete. She firmly rejects the notion of any substantive Fraserian influence. She argues instead that Evans had, quote, an original mind, and she argues that his ideas were shaped far more strongly by the evidence in front of him than is now often supposed or assumed. It should be acknowledged, and I think other speakers have stressed this, that it can be very difficult to pin down definitively the extent of particular influences. Evans rarely points us to any sources for his ideas or gives direct citations. Instead, we are primarily looking at specific wording or framing of ideas within his writings that may be suggestive or indicative for us. And if I may use the imagery of the tree with its branches and boughs, if we are pulling on one branch, let us say the Fraserian branch, it can be difficult to consider the greater complexity of all or many branches representing the intersections of ideas and influences. With that in mind, I suggest that alongside scholarly influences from Fraser and Harrison, there's also considerable evidence for other significant influences shaping Evans's views of the finds from his excavations. We can try to trace some of those branches by highlighting the ways in which Evans's goddess differs quite sharply from those presented in the work of Fraser or the Cambridge ritualists. I suggest there's an important interplay between key material finds from the site of Knossos and the wider ideas and ideologies of Evans' social and political world, so his world as lived in. It is this interplay which helps to explain, I suggest, the particular Minoan goddess which Evans and later his contemporaries following him fashioned from this evidence. Given that archaeology developed as a discipline through the late 19th and early 20th century, it's hardly surprising that a complex, dynamic, and sometimes contradictory nexus of ideas and ideologies current at the time, and these range from imperialism to psychoanalysis, from colonialism to official tracts of motherhood, and so on, informed archaeological practice and interpretations of scholars such as Evans. In what follows, I aim to trace several intersecting threads or branches. These are the claimed Europeanness of the Minoans, the clear importance of ideas of motherhood, and his conception of the goddess and his ideas around a kind of Minoan monotheism. Alongside this, I draw attention to the ambiguity of much Minoan imagery, which leaves us even today in our Minoanist world uncertain of the status and identification of specific figures. Are they goddesses, rulers, priestesses, ordinary human beings? This can be also seen to feed into Evans's changing views over time and his sometimes inconsistent or oscillating views. From the early days of excavation, it was clear that Crete had interacted with older and more established cultures of the Near East and Egypt, as indeed Evans frequently acknowledges. But the Minoan finds were quickly characterized as belonging to the heritage and origins of Europe. Contemporary concerns had an important role to play in this characterization, from questions of European identity, the emergence of nation states, and closer to home on the island, the removal of Crete from Ottoman Eastern rule in 1898. In this context, the Minoans were enthusiastically received as the oldest civilization in Europe. The public were presented with the oldest throne in Europe, and Evans comments in 1902, there is nothing more remarkable than the wonders of the Cnossian drainage system and the supposed flushing toilet. This idea of Europeanness, and by extension a distancing from the East, comes through clearly in descriptions of the art. And I'd like to pause to use a couple of examples to illustrate this point in a more concrete way. Writing after the very first season of excavation in the London Times with his collaborator Hogarth, so in 1900, we find a vivid description of one of the fresco fragments, the one illustrated here, and he writes, a beautiful life-size painting of a youth with a European, almost classically Greek profile, gives us the first real knowledge of the race who produced this mysterious early civilization. This evaluation of European, of Minoan art was readily accepted, becoming commonplace in both scholarly and more popular writings. And so I've just chosen one example from a very wide-ranging book about ancient art by Curtius in 1913, where he says Cretan art is the first revelation of a new European spirit, differs in its passionate mobility in the sharpest possible way from Oriental art. So there, as well as being told that it's European, we're setting up this opposition of it being very different and being valued differently. To illustrate the point with another fresco found also in the first year, Evans was writing, and here I've just taken a short excerpt. He's commenting on the women then in the miniature frescoes, and here an example of very heavy reconstruction. And he talks about these women as being truly Parisian. And so here the Parisianness makes it thoroughly modern. The link, or perhaps rather the jump to connecting the Minoans to modernity is, of course, striking, and it's been much commented on. And again, I wanted to illustrate for you how this translates into more popular books, this one by the prolific Reverend James Bakey, and his book, The Life of the Ancient Near East, which has a rather wonderful subtitle, Being Some Chapters on the Romance of Modern Excavation. And here he goes full flow. The attire of the ladies was staggeringly modern, evening dress extremely low cut, bit of a euphemism, puffed sleeves, skirts elaborately flounced from hem to waist, hair wonderfully frizzed and curled. So we have this very clear sense then of Europeanness being claimed or ascribed to this material. Alongside these claims to modernity, the Minoan finds directly influenced and inspired Jane Harrison. And again, it was within the first years of the excavation. Her more immediate and rather splendid reaction to seeing firsthand, she visited Knossos, she was shown some of the finds by Evans, the fragments of the ceiling, which became known as the Mountain Mother ceiling. And this is reconstructed drawing from the small clay fragments then, which very quickly appeared. And in her correspondence, I think I'm correct in remembering that it was Gilbert Murray, she says, my matriarchal soul was glad within me. And I like this bit even more. Zeus is nowhere. I always knew he was a tiresome parvenu. She carries on in the same tone in her published writings, referring again to this specific ceiling. She tells her reader in Prolegomena, in Crete most happily, the ancient figure of the mother has returned after long burial to the air. So, is Evans's conception of the Minoan goddess similar to that of Harrison, and indeed the much longer history of scholarship which lies behind this, one that hypothesized and promoted the idea of a universal great goddess or mother goddess, considered to belong to a more primitive stage of social organization, and more specifically, as in Fraser's framework, a goddess who was, quote, a personification of all the reproduction energies of nature. Such ideas held sway in scholarship until the mid-20th century, and I think it's quite easy now to forget that that was taken for granted for a very long time. And then instead of seeing a goddess in every figurine, spiral or curving hillside, archaeologists responded to the call to disentangle themselves from the embrace of the goddess. This has importantly created space for a healthy consideration of other important ways of thinking about Minoan religion. And here I just pick out in particular the importance of moves to think beyond theistic assumptions and to use, for example, ideas from new animisms. But the turn away from goddesses has perhaps created a scholarly reluctance to see not goddesses everywhere, but goddesses anywhere at all. And while it's frustrating to see each and every figurine unreflectively labelled as a goddess, it's equally troubling to read of the need to attack mother goddessism. And that comes from a scholarly work on figurines. In referencing Neolithic figurines from Crete, as well as much earlier Paleolithic finds in Europe and figurine material in the Near East, Evans shows clear awareness of these ideas, both in the Palace of Minos and in his earlier reports. Here and elsewhere, he refers to the more distant past as primitive, and he writes also of remnants of ancient matriarchy, though it's a misrepresentation, I think, to suggest that he saw his modern Minoans as primarily primitive or matriarchal. There are those threads in the work. As late as the 1950s, Crawford's The Eye Goddess, 1957, E.O. James, The Cult of the Mother Goddess, 1959, the covers of my copies of the books here, illustrate the tenacity of these ideas, though one can also point to Gordon Child's wonderfully acerbic comment addressed to his archaeological colleagues that collecting mother goddesses was a harmless outlet for the sexual impulses of old men. The term mother goddess can, of course, be used in a wide range of ways. It may refer to a creatrix of the world, a mother of other gods, or a mother of humans, to an actual mother or a goddess associated with nurturing capabilities, including reproduction and birth. But it may also be a title of respect for a deity who is not, in fact, closely linked to biological functions. It is clear, however, from Evans's language that although his deity was always for him multifaceted, he explicitly thought of her as closely associated with motherhood, writing of matronly breasts and organs of maternity. And since explicit depictions of sexual activity, pregnancy, birthing, or of mother with child are famously elusive in Minoan imagery, it's reasonable to ask why Evans was so drawn to such a maternal mother goddess. I've argued in more detail elsewhere that his insistence on these maternal aspects of the Minoan deity was influenced by the contemporary social values of the world in which he was born and grew up in particular, the pervasive ideologies of motherhood, which place both a physical and a moral onus on women to reproduce. But before summarizing the main ideas underpinning this ideology of motherhood, let us turn for a moment to a very famous group of material which can act as a lens for thinking about this, as well as the related issue of the ambiguities of Minoan imagery. During his fourth season of excavation at Knossos in 1903, Evans discovered a pair of stone-lined cists containing a stunning collection of faience. The cists, after cleaning and excavation, of course, there in the photograph to the left, and the fully reconstructed, heavily reconstructed, the two figures there on the slide. These included the now famous so-called snake goddesses. And in an early report, Evans wrote that for beauty and interest, these finds equaled and in some respects surpassed anything found in the whole courses of the Four Seasons excavations. I think that shows how fascinated he was with them right from the beginning. But we can glimpse to his very first impressions in a telegram sent to the treasurer of the Cretan Exploration Fund, George Macmillan, who sent it on to be published in the London Times in June 10th, 1903, and it's on the screen there. Season closes with discovery of extraordinary interest, and then he goes on to say a bit more about what he's found, but he says, still more important, all the porcelain figures in the round of goddess and votaries, about a foot high. Principal image, goddess, with snakes coiled about hair and forming her zone, she folds them out by their necks. Immediately present at the time of discovery is the theme then of goddess and votaries. He continued through his writings to waver over how to account for the multiple images, eventually relegating them to a supporting cast, though they are nowadays more typically all offered equal billing as snake goddesses. In their heavily restored forms, the two figures have become iconic, even poster girls for the Minoans in the popular imagination. I wonder if Evans would have found it surprising, annoying, or ironic that the figure with the snakes heavily coiled around her person has less visibility in terms of modern reception, reimaginings, and commodification than her slightly smaller sister. She's made a stunning appearance at the head of the Parade of History at the opening of the Olympic Games in 2004. Yet this faience figure is so heavily restored that, unlike her snake-encircled sister, her snakes have been called into question. And for those of you unfamiliar with the evidence, the slide at the top left shows the unreconstructed fragments in a drawing in Palace of Minos, and you can very clearly see that one arm is fully reconstructed as a mirror of the other, and the arm that is preserved has an arm and only the center of something that has like candy stripes around it. So it's been argued that they're not necessarily snakes. I suspect, though, that the dislodging of the snakes will not dislodge her as a modern icon and inspiration. Some things just take on a life of their own, don't they? On the slide you see before you then the figure, as I've said, in its more fragmentary form, together with some of the modern reimaginings. There's the 2004 Snake Goddess at the Olympic Games, Marina Abramovic's performance artist a year later. On the lower slide, contemporary etching, a graffiti in the second center in downtown Athens, where she's wonderfully morphed into a cyclops as well. And hot off the press to the lower right, a creative artwork from a very recent scholarly article about DNA and the Minoans, where the snakes have been imaginatively turned into DNA strands. And if I could, I'd like to take a moment to say that the reason these things are being collected is I'm a collaborator in a project called The Many Lives of a Snake Goddess, in collaboration with Nico Mamigliano and Ellen Adams. So that's an ongoing project on their receptions. He later selected the snake goddess described in that early telegram and now physically restored to appear complete as a watercolor frontispiece for the first volume of the Palace of Minos at Knossos, and there it is on the screen. Such was the general impact of these finds that a dozen or more goddesses, some of them with snakes, were subsequently forged and sold to collectors and museums eager to own such iconic images. And I should say, of course, that Evans endorsed many of them, and including the ivory goddess in the Boston Museum. As already noted, he quickly identified the first figure which came to light as a goddess, commenting quickly on her matronly breasts. He dubbed the second smaller figure, the one then that's become iconic with the outstretched arms and restored with a low cap topped by a feline, as an attendant or priestess to accompany her. However, there are, and many people don't realize this outside Minoan studies, there are fragments of other figures, so there aren't just two, including another arm with a snake twisting on it. He continued then to debate the identity of his figures, goddess and priestess, goddess and her double or duplicate, which is an interesting one. But he remained committed overall to the idea of a single deity whose functions were many and all-encompassing. But he returned time and again to the mother goddess aspect, stressing the exposed breast as, quote, a symbol of maternity. And as noted earlier, explicit chorotrophic imagery of mother and child outside the forgeries that appeared later is absent, but the reference to nurturing life and the suckling of the young is provided in the same excavation context in the temple repositories by faience plaques, relief plaques shown here on the right, of a cow and calf and a goat with her kid, suckling their young, offering a context from within the finds for thinking about a mother giving life-giving sustenance. I suggest, though, that Evans' focus on a mother goddess with an explicitly maternal character also makes sense not just from the finds, but from the wider context, the context of social evolutionary ideas, the tension between ideas of Europe and the Orient, and most importantly, the intense emphasis on an ideology of motherhood across Western Europe through this time. Motherhood was the focus of debate in modern Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries. There have, of course, always been mothers, but the idea of motherhood as a term is a more modern construct. In the 18th century, there was debate about the ills of wet nursing, widely practiced by wealthy women, and I just sort of point out that rehashes an argument had in ancient Rome as well. And in France, Rousseau emphasized the importance of the mother feeding her own baby. The image of Rousseau here standing, the patriarchal male figure standing in the center, looking at the woman doing her proper duty, breastfeeding her baby. And if you look to the right behind him, it's mirrored then by the image of the sheep with her lamb. So the woman and the animal part of nature, the construct then of nature culture. And I just for fun put on the other side that not everybody, sort of there was a kind of an ironic humorous response to this. If you look at that, you can see the picture on the wall of this being done properly and very maternally, but the modern fashionable lady, as you can see, is having a wee bit of trouble. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, motherhood was idealized, and there was a public preoccupation with it being crucial to the well-being of the state and the imperial nation. So the fact that there are also sort of series of major wars as well is important here. The Victorian and early Edwardian periods were characterized, at least as an ideal, by the sharp demarcation of male public and female private space, the famous separate spheres ideology, in which female devotion to the domestic ideal was seen as a sweet vocation, but at the same time a weighty moral responsibility, both for the household and for the nation. Motherhood was extolled, the service which the state most requires from the generality of women is motherhood and the maintenance of the family in purity and happiness. And I couldn't resist putting Queen Victoria in there. She's hardly the generality of women, but she also, of course, reproduced quite a few children. The need for women as creatures of their biology to conserve their energies for childbearing and rearing was pressed on women at every turn. Official pamphlets, endless manuals offering advice, a trend which remains with us today, medical writings, and religious moralizing teachings. All this contributed to and reinforced social ideology, but the ideology can also be subverted. Women were able to capitalize on public anxiety about the health of the nation, the poor health of men sent to fight in wars, or the decline in health and purity of the nation in the context of colonial expansion in order to argue for political rights. Western dualistic thought has separated the virtuous mother from the sexual temptress, the Madonna from the whore. This thinking has also translated into the good nurturing breast and the bad erotic breast, predisposing Evans to interpret his material as either maternal or as sensual and erotic. And we can see a glimpse of this again, looking at his own writings. In the Peloponnese, he refers to the Semitic types, and he's talking here just generally about Near Eastern figurines, took on an essentially sensuous character. And it's really interesting that he never attributes that. He actively says there is nothing erotic or sexual in Minoan art. Since the erotic was constructed as belonging to the sensuous world of the Orient and sort of emergence of Orientalist views then, Orientalism, and the Minoans had already been appropriated as belonging to Europe, it was the maternal reading which was mapped onto the Minoan female body. Motherhood was also idealized through the person of the Virgin Mary, and it's striking that the period in which the idea of the mother goddess, broadly speaking within archaeology and history of religion, closely coincides with something that is sometimes referred to as the Marian century, 1850 to 1950. Indeed, books written up till this time, such as James's Cult of the Mother Goddess, which I referred to earlier, offered a view of female divinity, which saw a continuous link from the early mother goddess of the Neolithic through to the Virgin Mary, the Madonna, the Panagia. Interestingly, Evans does not follow this universalizing model in any kind of consistent way, although again, I would emphasize that I think that his views oscillate and are inconsistent over time. But he instead suggests a special relationship between his motherly goddess and Christianity. In his publications, he refers to the mother goddess, who was also a virgin, a pretty astonishing claim without any possible evidence, at least not any that I can think of, but a modern model was close at hand in the Madonna or the Virgin Mary. The Madonna was also a useful model for the goddess with many aspects or titles, such as Lady of the Doves, Lady of the Double Axes, Mistress of the Animals. And he also linked Minoan religion with Christianity in other ways, which draws together the themes of motherhood and monotheism. And I just was terribly struck yesterday by Ronald Hutton's talk, where he talked about Fraser's attitude to religion. And I hadn't really thought about this before, but of course it emphasizes how differently Evans is positioning himself in terms of his own valuing and sense of religion, which comes through here. So his personal views or how he sees this working in the world in a much less negative way than we heard about with Fraser. So, for example, Evans writes that Minoan religion was of a unitary type and that its motherly appeal gave it an emotional hold on its adherents, anticipating that a good deal of the Christian church. I put on the slide a selection of quotes taken from across the Pallas of Minos volumes, so across the time that he was writing, illustrating how he circled back to these ideas: motherly, a single divinity, one with a spiritual hold. Hence, while his monotheism could be understood, and I think it sometimes does hark back to primitive monotheism couched at this time as representing an earlier and inferior stage of human development as it was presented, it's also, on the other hand, touched by a modern Christian sensibility through his eyes, bringing the Minoans closer to modern Europe and separating them out from other Oriental cultures of the Mediterranean, as well as magically leapfrogging them over the polytheistic classical world. These ideas were, however, contested by his contemporaries, who found his ideas unsubstantiated and, I suggest, also unpalatable, as evidenced here in Nilsson's major work on Aegean religion. And so here just the very famous, well-known quote where he's saying, well, this can't be right because actually it inverts the way we think religion works. So he's criticizing it just as much on the basis of his own assumptions about the evolution of religion as on the evidence. So it's the inverse of general development. I think the review of it in the Journal of Hellenic Studies is even more revealing, and it suggests to me a sort of sense that this can't be right. Monotheism is a fine flower of religious thought, so it's attaching a value to it which can't possibly belong to this earlier period. And it says then, you know, the Minoan mother goddess, we must recognize rather the usual variety of goddesses with specialized functions. Despite Evans's monotheistic tendencies, he writes in correspondence to Nilsson, and they had a correspondence about this. Nilsson publishes it as a footnote in his book, and I think this is an interesting point. And in response to the critiques, he said, I've always had in mind the possibility that the goddess may cover what were really regarded as separate divinities with separate names, but as a provisional procedure, and as he says, it is convenient in default of more definite knowledge to treat the goddess as essentially the same great nature goddess under various aspects. Now, I have seen that people have critiqued this and said, oh, he didn't really mean it. You know, he means what he says when he says it's a great goddess. And I think that that's, you know, we have to take on face value. I think that this again represents oscillation of views and uncertainty that arises from the ambiguity of the evidence that he saw before him. For archaeologists trying to work with fragments of the past to understand the cognitive world of a culture, the use of goddess singular can be seen as problematic, since it seems to imply belief in a single overarching female deity, and so imposes or presupposes a belief structure which lies, of course, in the realm of hypothesis. Yet in the continued absence of the definitive knowledge, definite knowledge, and frustrating ambiguities of visual and material evidence, many Minoan scholars still find it practical to use goddess singular, but, quote, to designate a conceptual and visual category. And those are the words of Jerry Gazelle. And that leaves us not so far away from Evans's musings around the one and the many. So in conclusion, taken together then, the branches or strands of being modern and European, of ideologies of motherhood, and Evans's unusual flavour of monotheism can all be seen as reinforcing one another. And I suggest that they offer a useful parallel way of thinking about Evans's Minoan goddesses as markedly different from those evoked in the works of Fraser or Jane Harrison. Thank you.